In 1938, an American could legally purchase a bottle of cancer cure made from herbs and sawdust, and the federal government could do absolutely nothing about it. This was the law of the land, and it had been for decades. But to understand how we got here, you have to rewind half a century to an era when medicine was less science and more spectacle. The patent medicine boom of the 1880s was built on a single, devastating truth. The scientific community had no concrete way to prove which medicines actually worked. Into this vacuum stepped an army of hucksters. They sold tonics from the back pages of newspapers, promising cures for chronic pain, female complaints, kidney trouble, and nearly everything else. And because these patent medicines, which notably usually weren't patented at all, required no prescription, the customer could self-diagnose and self-medicate in perfect privacy. The products were as dangerous as they were ingenious. Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound, marketed to cure serious ailments but primarily taken by women for menstrual cramps and menopause symptoms, contained roughly 20% alcohol. Far darker was Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, given to fussy infants. It contained morphine. And this is when the term snake oil took on its sinister meaning, ironically because real snake oil, brought to America by Chinese railroad workers, was a genuinely effective anti-inflammatory rich in omega-3 acids. But in the hands of fraudsters like Clark Stanley, snake oil became a label for anything sold with empty promises. When federal investigators finally seized a shipment of Stanley's product in 1917, they found mineral oil, beef fat, red pepper, and turpentine, not a drop of actual snake. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 was supposed to fix this. It didn't. It only required that products not be misbranded or adulterated in ways that would kill you immediately. It never demanded proof they worked. Even the American Medical Association's voluntary seal of approval, launched in 1929, was porous and industry-funded. That single missing requirement, proof of effectiveness, would quietly poison the system for decades. Then came 1938. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act finally required proof of safety before a drug could be sold. It said nothing about proof of effectiveness. That loophole sat silently for 24 long years, and the drug companies knew exactly how to use it. The 1938 law created a perverse incentive that transformed American medicine overnight. Once a drug proved safe for any single purpose, companies could legally market it for literally anything, curing arthritis, soothing anxiety, dissolving kidney stones. Proof of safety, not efficacy, was the only passport required. The consequences were catastrophic by design. In the 1940s and 1950s, an entire industry emerged around the combination drug, single capsules that mixed penicillin with antihistamines, painkillers, and even caffeine. Companies claimed synergistic effects, that these mixtures worked better together than apart. There was zero evidence to support this. But there didn't need to be. The law demanded only that the component ingredients be safe, not that the combination itself accomplish anything. Consider Upjohn's Panalba, a combination antibiotic marketed aggressively for everything from respiratory infections to skin conditions. Later investigation revealed it could cause serious kidney damage while providing no therapeutic benefit beyond what a single ingredient offered. Yet for years, it was a top seller. The FDA's enforcement powers were nearly useless. The agency had to catch a company in the act of misbranding, and proving a drug didn't work in court was nearly impossible because the scientific standards for efficacy simply didn't exist yet. Controlled trials were still in their infancy. If a company claimed something worked and their evidence was a doctor's anecdotal testimonial, the agency was powerless. Meanwhile, the pharmaceutical industry had become one of the most profitable in America and wielded its wealth accordingly. Drug companies poured money into congressional lobbying and funded medical education, molding a generation of physicians who trusted brand name claims without question. And then there was Frances Kelsey, though she was hardly a name anyone knew yet. In the early 1950s, she worked quietly as a pharmacology editor at the American Medical Association's journal, where she first encountered the industry's marketing claims. She was deeply frustrated. Every day, she watched companies overstate what their drugs could do, knowing there was no legal mechanism to stop them. But the real storm was brewing across the Atlantic. In 1953, a German company called Grunenthal synthesized a new compound. Initial animal tests showed no obvious toxicity. The company saw a future blockbuster. And not a single person in that laboratory knew the devastation that was about to unfold. By 1960, thalidomide was the best-selling sedative in the world, and it was being handed out like candy to pregnant women. The drug had hit the German market in October 1957, marketed by Grunenthal as a safe, non-addictive answer to anxiety, insomnia, and most devastatingly, morning sickness. The marketing was relentless and brilliant. Grunenthal positioned thalidomide as so benign that it was sold over the counter in pharmacies across Germany, Belgium, and other nations. Doctors received free samples by the thousands, encouraged to distribute them to any patient who complained of sleepless nights or queasy stomachs. By 1960, the drug was sold in 46 countries under dozens of brand names: Distaval, Contergan, Softenon, Neurosedin, each capped with the same reassuring promise: absolute safety. But the early warning signs were there, and they were ignored. Patients began reporting peripheral neuritis, a painful tingling and numbness in their hands and feet, a clear sign of nerve damage. Grunenthal dismissed the reports as anecdotal and unrelated. When independent researchers raised concerns about the neurological effects, the company responded with legal threats, not investigations. And as tens of thousands of German women took the drug to calm their pregnancy-related nausea, a public health time bomb ticked silently inside their bodies. Then, in late 1961, two physicians on separate continents noticed something impossible to ignore. In Australia, obstetrician William McBride delivered a baby with phocomelia, a rare condition where limbs are severely shortened or absent entirely. He had seen one such case before. Curious, he asked every mother in his practice who had given birth to deformed babies one question: "What did you take during pregnancy?" Every single one had taken thalidomide. Thousands of miles away in Germany, pediatrician Widukind Lenz was reaching the same horrifying conclusion, tracking case after case of phocomelia to mothers who had used the drug. The discovery triggered a worldwide recall in November 1961, but the damage was already done. More than 10,000 children were born with severe deformities across Germany, Britain, Australia, Japan, and dozens of other nations. Many were missing arms entirely. Others had flipper-like hands growing directly from their shoulders. But here is the question that haunts the story. Thalidomide destroyed lives across 6 continents, yet it somehow never reached Americans. The answer rests with a woman who joined the FDA in September 1960, just days before the American licensee, Richardson Merrill, submitted its application for approval. Frances Kelsey had never heard of thalidomide. When the thick application landed on her desk, within months, she would become the single obstacle standing between the drug and millions of American mothers. And she would not bend, no matter how hard the industry pushed back. A single desk, stacked with paper, held the power to change the course of American medicine forever. That desk belonged to Dr. Frances Kathleen Oldham Kelsey, a 46-year-old Canadian-born pharmacologist who, in September 1960, had just started her new job as a medical officer at the Food and Drug Administration. She was one of only 7 full-time physicians reviewing drugs for the entire nation, and the newest, least experienced one on the bench. Her path to that desk was anything but typical. Born in 1914 in Vancouver, British Columbia, Kelsey had earned a PhD in pharmacology from the University of Chicago in 1938, an extraordinary achievement for a woman in an era when female scientists were routinely steered toward nursing or teaching. More critically, her doctoral research had focused on how drugs affect pregnant animals. She had studied which substances could pass through the placental barrier. It was deeply esoteric work that most of her colleagues considered irrelevant to day-to-day drug review. Within months, that obscure knowledge would make her the most important regulator in America. The application that landed on her desk was from Richardson Merrill Pharmaceuticals, the American licensee for a German sedative called Thalidomide, which they intended to sell under the brand name Kefauver. The file was thick, confident, polished. It contained volumes of studies, testimonials, and marketing data. Everything about it projected certainty. Kelsey read it skeptically. Then she read it again. The problems were unmistakable. The drug's safety data relied on animal studies that were poorly designed and sloppily documented. The clinical claims were vague. How exactly did this drug produce its calming effect? No one could say. And critically, Kelsey had noticed an unusual detail buried in the fine print. Some patients had developed peripheral neuritis, tingling and numbness in their extremities, suggesting the drug affected the nervous system. She recalled a letter published in the British Medical Journal in December 1960, written by a doctor named Leslie Florence, connecting thalidomide to those exact neurological symptoms. She also knew from her own decades-old research that if a drug affected the nervous system, there was a real possibility it could cross the placenta. So she asked a simple question: where is the evidence that this drug is safe for pregnant women? Richardson Merrill had none, not a single study. They had, however, already begun distributing the drug for experimental research purposes. The loose FDA rules allowed companies to hand out unapproved drugs to doctors, who gave them to roughly 20,000 patients, dozens of whom were pregnant. The company pushed back. Then they pressured her. They filed revised applications, each one thicker and more insistent. They called her superiors. Some of them suggested she was being obstructionist, that she was slowing down the FDA's review process over theoretical concerns. Frustrated executives visited her office. Still, she held her ground, repeating the same question each time: where is the evidence? The standoff dragged on for over a year, a bureaucratic stalemate that would end in November 1961, when news from Europe finally arrived. Reports confirmed that mothers who had taken thalidomide during pregnancy were delivering babies with horrifying birth defects. At least 4,000 children across Germany and Britain were already affected. Sitting alone at her desk reading the Y reports, Frances Kelsey realized a terrible truth. She had been right all along. And that correctness had just made her the most valuable civil servant in America. One phone call in late November 1961 transformed a stalled political crusade into the most consequential drug legislation in American history. Across Washington, a handful of congressional staffers suddenly realized they had a scandal big enough to break the pharmaceutical industry's grip on Capitol Hill. The man at the center of that crusade was Tennessee Senator Estes Kefauver. Since 1959, he had been holding hearings on the drug industry, but his original focus was economics, not safety. He wanted to know why prescription prices were so high, why the same drug cost 3 times more in America than in Europe, and why companies spent more on advertising than on research. His proposed legislation targeted price controls and antitrust violations, not efficacy. The hearings themselves were a study in frustration. Industry executives testified with practiced calm, defending their pricing as the natural cost of innovation. They invoked the staggering sums spent on research laboratories and clinical trials, implicitly arguing that any impediment to profit was an impediment to medical progress. Meanwhile, a parade of distinguished physicians offered the more damning testimony scattered throughout the record. Doctors describing a flood of new miracle drugs, with no comparative evidence, no head-to-head trials, no proof that these expensive new compounds outperformed cheaper existing treatments or performed at all. In one exchange, a professor of medicine described receiving a drug promotion that claimed the product worked for almost everything, with not a single controlled study to support it. Politically, however, the hearings were going nowhere. The drug industry spent lavishly on lobbying, and many senators were content to let sleeping dogs lie. Kefauver's amendment was bleeding out slowly in committee, destined, by all appearances, for a quiet death. Then the thalidomide story broke. Kefauver staff, led by Chief Counsel John Blair, had been monitoring the European reports of birth defects with growing alarm. Now they had something they never expected, a national tragedy that proved everything they had been arguing for years, and a hero in Frances Kelsey, who had single-handedly stopped the drug at America's borders. The phones in their offices rang off the hook. Journalists demanded answers. Constituents, suddenly terrified of the medicine in their own cabinets, demanded action. Politicians who had been lukewarm about regulating drug companies pivoted overnight into champions of reform. The industry counterattacked with fury. The Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association argued that requiring proof of efficacy would cripple innovation, delay life-saving treatments for years, and bury small companies under regulatory costs. But the emotional weight of the moment was against them. Every photograph of a child with shortened limbs was a rebuttal no lobbyist could answer. In March 1962, Senator Kefauver introduced his revised amendment, now including the requirement that drug manufacturers prove both safety and effectiveness before marketing and submit to rigorous, well-controlled studies. The battle moved to the floor of Congress, where the most powerful industry in America prepared its final stand. And the quiet pharmacologist from Vancouver, who had resisted 12 months of pressure, would be called to testify before the whole nation. The Senate hearing room fell silent the moment she entered, and Frances Kelsey, who had spent 16 months asking one quiet question, suddenly found herself the most famous civil servant in America. It was August 1962, and the soft-spoken pharmacologist was about to testify before a committee investigating the very industry she had single-handedly defied. Reporters who had never heard her name now jostled for space as she took her seat. When she described her review of thalidomide, her refusal to approve a drug whose evidence was missing, the room erupted in applause. Within days, President John F. Kennedy summoned her to the White House, presenting her with the President's Award for Distinguished Federal Civilian Service, the highest honor a civilian can receive, alongside a check for $10,000. Newspapers called her a heroine. Mothers wrote her letters of gratitude. Overnight, the obscure medical officer, standing between an unchecked industry and the American public, had become a national symbol of integrity. Yet the legislative battle had barely begun. The drug industry mounted its final desperate lobbying campaign. The arguments were predictable. The FDA was already stretched impossibly thin. Requiring proof of effectiveness was a matter of clinical judgment, not regulation, and the bill would crush small companies. Lobbyists flooded congressional offices, warning of a stagnant pharmaceutical industry and delayed cures. But this time, the emotional arithmetic had shifted. Every senator knew about the thousands of European children born with shortened limbs. They knew about the 39 American women who had taken thalidomide samples during pregnancy. And they knew the only reason that number wasn't in the tens of thousands was a single FDA reviewer who had refused to back down. The Senate passed the Kefauver-Harris Amendment unanimously, 7-8-0. The House followed. On October 10, 1962, President Kennedy signed the law with Senator Kefauver standing beside him. The consequences rippled outward for decades. The FDA now faced a colossal mandate: review every drug marketed since 1938 for proof of effectiveness, over 4,000 products. The Drug Efficacy Study Implementation Project, launched in 1966, enlisted the National Academy of Sciences to conduct the reviews. The results were damning. Slightly more than 40% of the drugs examined had substantial evidence of effectiveness. Hundreds were pulled from the market entirely, including Upjohn's Penalba, the combination antibiotic that had been a top seller for years despite causing kidney damage with no proven benefit. Frances Kelsey stayed at the FDA for 45 more years, reviewing drugs, mentoring younger scientists, and building an infrastructure of clinical evidence requirements that would become the gold standard worldwide. She retired in 2005 at the age of 91. The amendment signed that October day bears the names Kefauver and Harris, two legislators who fought a powerful industry. But the truth, as history would quietly note, was simpler. The 1962 amendment was called the Kefauver-Harris Amendment, but it was Frances Kelsey who made it necessary and possible. Today, every prescription pill in America, every drug that requires rigorous clinical trials before it touches a patient, is a product of that single desk, that single repeated question, and the one woman who refused to accept anything less than evidence. And that is the standard we still live by, more than 60 years later.